When I was a little baby linguist, just barely in high school, I went through a stage where I was a prescriptivist. I knew the rules for commas, when to use whom. I even answered the phone by saying, "This is he," when people asked after me. Needless to say, I am still ashamed of this part of my life and look back on it with the utmost contempt. Sure, I know this is a normal part of every linguist's development. It's sort of like how physicists go insane after they turn 45, but that doesn't stop it from being cringe. Eventually, I figured out the glories of descriptivism, saw the errors in my cringe ways, and realized I could upgrade from my old ways of prescriptive pedantry to descriptive pedantry, otherwise known as pedantry platinum plus. Why would I obsess over what some musty book says, like a nerd, when I could obsess over what happens in the real world? It's because of that experience that I am, frankly, appalled to find that people, to this day, even the linguistically aware, have deluded themselves into thinking that English needs a spelling reform, and that French spelling is somehow absurd. Today, I want to explain two things: why spelling reforms are largely unnecessary for languages like English and French, and why spelling reforms for English would be next to impossible. The first thing I want to explain is why spelling reforms are largely unnecessary. You see, your brain is actually pretty good at pattern recognition and storing all the patterns it knows. It doesn't take too much extra effort to learn a few extra rules, so all of those silent letters in English and French don't actually place too much of a burden on people learning to read, and in a lot of cases, they're actually pretty useful. Bah! Addy, I hear you say, hast thou gone insane? I mean, sure, synonymy might not exist, but this is the French word for bird, and it is pronounced oiseau. How could that be useful? I know, dear viewer, I know. To some, it might sound crazy, but the thing is, silent and redundant letters do a lot of work, which can make reading easier, not harder. The first of these is that they can preserve connections to other words. Words like soften, brighten, lighten, tighten, moisten, and fasten all contain silent T's. But if you know that the en suffix in English makes verbs out of adjectives, then you can figure out what the word it comes from is. Sure, this isn't the most amazing example, but by preserving the spelling of the stem, you can make the meaning easier to figure out if you don't know a word. This fact should be familiar to anyone who's studied Japanese, where kanji are used to show the core meaning of a word, while suffixes are written in hiragana. Speaking of Japanese, redundant or silent letters are really useful for clearing up homophones, especially those generated out of sound changes. In Japanese, kanji do a lot of work to clear up ambiguity. But if you want a really extreme example of this, in Mandarin there's an entire genre of poems which are only intelligible when written down, but which are near incomprehensible tongue twisters when spoken aloud. The most famous of which is Lion-Eating Poet in the Stone Den, which has nearly 100 characters, all of which are pronounced with the syllable sh, the only difference between them being the tone. If it helps, you can think of this as a more extreme buffalo sentence. Though not quite as extreme, English also has plenty of homophones which it spells differently, some of which, like night and tonight, even make use of silent letters to help distinguish them. The same is true of French as well. Due to a series of sound changes, modern French spelling is a few hundred years out of date, and now there are more homophones than there used to be. But here's the thing, those homophones are still all spelled differently. So you're unlikely to run into any confusion when reading or writing. Plus, a lot of the supposedly silent letters in French, especially at the ends of words, actually do get pronounced in some contexts. This is called liaison. Consider the difference between grand and le grand édifice. If it weren't written there, you'd think that D came out of nowhere. French orthography is actually simple enough that even though I don't speak it and have never studied it, I'm confident that I could give a reasonable estimate about how most words are pronounced in French. I will say, though, the correspondence between spelling and sound, to the best of my knowledge, mostly goes one way. But that's hardly the worst thing in any language, and plenty of languages have more extreme spelling. Next, old spelling can bridge language varieties. When Basque orthography was being decided on, most Basque speakers didn't pronounce H's at the beginning of words anymore, but one variety still did. What were they to do? Should they make the minority learn to figure out when there was or wasn't an H? Or should they make everyone write an H even if they didn't say it? The answer they selected was to write the H, because it's easier to learn to not pronounce letters that are there than to pronounce letters that aren't. They could have also had 2 different orthographies, but then everyone would have had to know both, which would have created a needless schism in the community. In many languages, preserving older spellings can facilitate communication between different regions that might pronounce words differently. So even as accents drift, you can still make sure speakers can understand each other's writing. Finally, they shore up limitations in an orthography. Not every language is equally well suited to every writing system. Chinese characters, for example, don't work well for languages like English and French, while the Roman alphabet is far from the best at handling languages like Mandarin. Even the IPA has flaws. Now, if a language develops its own writing system, this usually isn't a problem, as speakers will design something that works for them. But what happens when you borrow one? Well, you gotta make changes, and if you're gonna make changes, you've got 2 options. Add new letters, or add silent letters. The Roman alphabet worked really well for Latin, but then the Germans had to go and ruin it by learning to read. The Roman alphabet was built for a language with 5 vowels, which is insufficient for Germanic languages, which can have between 12 and 20 vowels. So unless your spelling reform is going to advocate adding an extra 10 letters to the alphabet, it's not really going to solve the core issue. As to why reforming English wouldn't be feasible? For starters, people can already read. English-speaking countries already have fairly high literacy rates. The same is true of France, China, and Japan. People who talk about reforming English rarely consider if we actually need a reformation at all. Beyond that, though, if we did reform English, which variety would we choose to be the standard? Do we pick General American, Received Pronunciation, Southern English? You can only pick one variety to base the new standard off of. And even if you did select one variety for your standard, you need to update it to make sure that minimal pairs, words that differ only by one sound, are always written differently. Your options would be to either invent a bunch of extra letters or invent new spelling conventions for each vowel. And do you want to write like this? Because that's how you get spelling like that. Plus, even if you pick a variety to be the standard, reforming how we write vowels isn't even really possible. Remember the soft, soften example I gave earlier? Yeah, well, our vowels have a similar thing going on called reduction, where they can change depending on the stressed syllable, which is a problem for consistent spelling. On top of that, English doesn't just have stress at the word level, it has it at the sentence level. The sentences, I didn't stab him, I didn't stab him, and I didn't stab him, all mean something different. So do we bolden words? Extra accents, maybe? Underlining, perhaps? There's no good answer, but that's the issue with spelling reforms. Sometimes they're necessary and useful, but often the pushes for them are over the top and poorly thought out. They're best done slowly and by allowing alternative spellings into the language through descriptive practices. A little prescriptivism here or there, mixed with native speaker intuition, should handle it in time, and sooner or later, it will turn out just fine. And in the meanwhile, there's more important things to worry about.
Don't add Y or Z, just add silent E.